Hi everyone, welcome. It's noon. Welcome to Child and Adolescent Psychiatry Grand Rounds. My name is Chuan Mei Lee. I'm an assistant professor in child psychiatry, and I'm subbing in for Dr. Stewart today in hosting this Child and Adolescent Psychiatry Grand Rounds. This is the last Grand Rounds of our 2022, and we are closing out with a bang. We have the great fortune of having Adriana Galván here presenting to us today. Dr. Galván is a professor of psychology and the Dean of Undergraduate Education at the University of California, Los Angeles. She is the co-executive director of the UCLA Center for the Developing Adolescent. Her expertise is in adolescent brain development. Her research focuses on characterizing the neural mechanisms underlying adolescent behavior to inform policy, for example, juvenile justice. She received her BA from Barnard College, Columbia University, and her PhD in neuroscience from Cornell. She has received multiple awards for her work, including from the National Academy of Sciences, the American Psychological Association, Cognitive Neuroscience Society, and William T. Grant Foundation. She is also the recipient of the UCLA Gold Shield Faculty Prize. In 2018, she was a Fulbright Scholar in Barcelona, and in 2019, she received the Presidential Early Career Award for Science and Engineers. And with that, let's give a warm welcome to Dr. Galván. Please take it away.
Thank you, Dr. Lee. I really appreciate that kind introduction. So I'll go ahead and share my screen. Can you all hear me okay? Great, thank you. Okay. So today we'll be talking about the attributes of the adolescent reward system. I have most of my career studied how motivational systems in the brain support the ontogenetic changes that we know to be characteristic of adolescence. And most of that is related to how adolescents process reward and how they take that information to seek out their own developmental needs. Adolescent brain development is necessary to support these key developmental outcomes during adolescence. However, a lot of the narrative around adolescence focuses in on how adolescents may make choices that adults deem inappropriate or impulsive or poor decision-making. So this is just a few examples of how the media often portrays adolescents as being crazy or the society having to suffer through the terrible teens. But luckily, there's a refreshing narrative shift about adolescence. And instead of focusing in on the potentially negative outcomes of adolescence, and I don't say that we shouldn't acknowledge or recognize the challenges that some adolescents may endure, it's also important for research on adolescence to paint the whole story about adolescence, that adolescence isn't just a time of storm and strife, as has been written about, but also a time of great opportunity. And that as a society, if we're to advance the investment into adolescence, not just in terms of financial dollars, but also in terms of the attention we pay to adolescents, the research that we conduct also has to keep pace with that narrative. Adolescence actually doesn't have a firm definition among scholars who study adolescence, but roughly it's between the ages of 10 and 25. Kickstarted with the onset of puberty at around age 10, but of course there's variability in when people achieve puberty through the mid-20s. And the end point of adolescence is also challenging to define because it coincides with taking on more adult roles, and that varies by society, by culture. But roughly, we know that there's a different developmental periods of adolescence between early adolescence, middle adolescence, late adolescence, and young adulthood. And each of these periods is characterized not just by changes in brain development or pubertal development, but also in what we do in our daily activities, what society expects of us. But throughout this period, we discover, we learn from, and we adapt to the world around us. And the adolescent brain supports these changes. There are many things that are unique to adolescence. Obviously, in about 50 minutes, I can't get through all of them, but here I've highlighted some that are particularly salient when we think of adolescents and people in this age range. And I'll focus on a few of these throughout the talk. I'll first start talking about brain development and why it's so important that we understand the changes that happen in particular parts of the brain during adolescence. There are at least two major developmental milestones during the period of adolescence. The first are changes that occur in fronto-mesolimbic circuitry. So brain regions that are involved in motivation, in reward seeking, in risk-taking, in the striatum, and then also the ongoing development of the prefrontal cortex. That's probably no surprise to anybody in here in this audience that the brain develops from the back to the front. And what that means is that how the functions change during adolescence and early adulthood are really been focused on changes that happen in the prefrontal cortex, regions that are important for emotion regulation, for thinking about the future, for goal direction. All of this happens in the prefrontal cortex. But it's important to recognize that there's a collaboration between the prefrontal cortex and regions that are supportive of these motivational systems. There's also a strengthening of neural connections, as represented on the right side of this slide, by which regions that communicate, the regions that are intended to communicate with each other, mostly from the front of the brain to the back of the brain or the inner workings of the brain, are strengthened during adolescence. And that doesn't just simply happen through an ontogenetic process, but also because of the inputs that the adolescent is receiving. And that's why understanding adolescence, not just what happens in brain development, but thinking about the context in which adolescents develop is critically important to understand this period of life. This is now a relatively old slide that was taken from research done when I was a graduate student with B.J. Casey, in which we were interested in establishing what is it that characterizes the adolescent reward system. So in order to study that, we asked adolescents and children and adults to come to the laboratory and get a brain scan, in which we presented them with different rewards. In this case, they were monetary rewards. And what we found is that, unsurprisingly, and similar to rodent research, the striatum is heavily implicated in responding to and attending to rewarding stimuli in the environment, as represented on the left. What we learned was that the adolescent brain showed an uptick in reaction to the rewarding stimuli as compared to children and compared to adults. This was interesting to us because it suggested that even though people of all ages represent reward in the same space, in the same neurobiological space, the adolescent is either paying more attention to reward or showing greater reaction to the reward. And that obviously has implications for where they attend their attention in their everyday life. And by the way, I should say that we did this initial study with money, but we've gone on to replicate this finding with different stimuli, whether it's attractive faces or even primary rewards like a drop of sugar water in the mouth also elicits the same bump in activation of the reward system during adolescence. One way to explain this is through this cartoon I'll show you now. In the dopaminergic system in adults, here I'm representing two neurons, a presynaptic and a postsynaptic neuron. The purple dots represent dopamine and the green receptors represent dopamine receptors. If we imagine this to be what it looks like in adults, the adolescent brain shows, and these are data based on a synthesis of research in rodents, the adolescent brain has more synaptic vesicles, greater dopaminergic response or release in response to a rewarding stimuli, and more dopamine receptors. And therefore, it's relatively unsurprising that there's greater or more robust reaction in the dopamine system in adolescence. Of course, we don't have this level of granularity in human adolescents. We don't know if this is exactly the case, but given the concentration of activation in the striatal or mesolimbic systems, as based on MRI studies, we can infer that this same surge in dopamine is also representing this surge in reward sensitivity in human adolescents. We often think about the mesolimbic system as being a central place where reward happens, where we represent excitement or attraction to something in the environment. And that is certainly true. But the mesolimbic system is also heavily implicated in reinforcement learning. And animal work shows that dopamine is a learning signal. So following the findings regarding the adolescent brain's response to reward, I became very interested in thinking about how the adolescent brain may be facilitating reinforcement learning. Because we know that something that is unique to adolescence is that a lot of learning occurs. Early in life, there's learning about basic functions, how to walk, how to talk, how to bond with caregivers. But during adolescence, similar mechanisms are in place to support the transition into adolescence and then into adulthood. And a lot of learning has to happen. Not just learning that happens in the classroom, like more sophisticated reading or writing or calculus or math, but also learning about the socio-emotional environment, how to establish relationships with people, how to read a room. All of this occurs and is facilitated by the enhanced learning mechanisms that occur during adolescence. So we were interested in studying the neurobiological mechanisms of this new skill. To do this work, I collaborated with Daphna Shohami and her then graduate student, Juliet Davidow at Columbia University. Dr. Shohami is an expert in learning systems, and she doesn't typically work with adolescent populations, but we joined forces to study and answer these questions. Are adolescents better than adults at learning from reinforcement? And this was based on this hypothesis was based on the notion that a lot of learning happens in the striatum. And if the adolescent brain is more excitable in the striatum, perhaps it does more than just code reward, but also helps facilitate learning. We questioned whether there was an advantage that was related to enhanced engagement of mesolimbic learning systems. In the study, we recruited a group of adolescents and a group of adults. Both were within average IQ range, and you can see the age range here in this slide. This was a task that we used. It was one that she's used often. It's a probabilistic learning task. We modified the stimuli a bit to be a little bit more interesting for adolescents. And the cover story was that adolescents were to decide which flower the butterfly would land on. And they learned, for example, that this blue butterfly preferred the pink flower over time by doing many trials on a task. So this is what it looked like. They would see a cue. In the beginning, they would guess left or right. Does the butterfly prefer pink or white? Here they chose pink, and then they would get reinforced, or they would look at the answer, and here the answer was correct. And you'll notice, obviously, that there's a birdhouse here, and these incidental images were used later to test their memory and to ask the question of whether or not they had better memory for things that were associated with a positive outcome. What we found is that there was greater activation in learning systems in the adolescents. Here I'm showing you data along the top, looking at activation in the hippocampus, on the bottom, activation in the striatum, the two main learning systems. And you'll note that there was greater engagement in both learning systems in the adolescents as compared to the adults. We also found that there was greater connectivity between the hippocampus and the putamen, another striatal region, in adolescents, but not in the adults. That was greater for learned versus unlearned outcomes. In other words, when they answered correctly, when their brain was processing the information and making the associations correctly, only in the adolescents did we see the stronger connectivity between the learning systems. And we think this helps explain the behavioral data, which is always the more interesting data of how they were behaving on the task. What you're looking at here is learning accuracy on the y-axis. The number of trials are represented in the x-axis. Early on in the task, the adolescents and the adults showed no difference in their accuracy. They were, a little bit above chance. But over time on the task, the adolescents outperformed the adults. This was a bit surprising because usually on cognitive tasks, the adults perform better. But we interpret these data as being informed by the data I just showed you from the brain. So the enhanced engagement of the learning systems in the adolescents is what can explain the enhanced learning accuracy in the adolescents in terms of their behavior. They were better at learning from this probabilistic feedback than the adults were. Now, I mentioned that the reinforcement phase included this feedback of correct versus incorrect. And we surprised them with a memory test at the end of the study, where we asked them whether or not they remembered the incidental images like this birdhouse. And then we determined whether or not this was tied with the reinforcing event. And what we found is that adolescents showed this positivity bias. That is, they had better memory for positive, being correct, versus negative, being incorrect reinforcement events. And perhaps that's tied to the greater reward sensitivity in adolescents, that they're better at learning from things that feel good, that are positive as compared to the adults. We also found that connectivity relationship between the putamen and the hippocampus in the adolescents was also related to their memory bias, by which those who had a stronger connectivity between the hippocampus and the striatum also had better memory for positive events as compared to negative events. There was no relation of the kind in adults. So to summarize, one of the attributes of the adolescent reward system is that the heightened striatal sensitivity that has been shown not just in our lab, but in labs all across the world, heightened striatal sensitivity in adolescents is not unique to reward sensitivity. It's not the case that having greater dopamine release in response to a stimulus is only meaningful for rewarding events in the environment, but also for learning about that environment. And that this is strengthened because of increases in how the hippocampus is communicating with the striatum, which is related to a memory advantage in adolescents, but not adults. There's also greater sensitivity to reinforcements in adolescents that are related to better learning from feedback in adolescents and adults. We can imagine how this has implications, not just for learning about the social world and getting positive reinforcements, but also in the classroom and how positive reinforcements may enhance learning in adolescents. I was reminded of these data when I read in the New York Times a few years ago reference to something called the reminiscence bump, and that is that there's this finding, not exactly anecdotal, but based in some data, that some memories that are experienced during adolescence have a longer lasting impact later in our lives than memories that are established earlier or later in life. And one way to test this is through music, and this is what the New York Times data reflect, that the strongest musical preferences for adults are set during adolescence. And maybe that's not surprising, but as someone who studies adolescence, I think about how rewarding music can be during adolescence and why that may remind us of positive memories later in life. And in part, it's probably because of this enhanced learning about associations and positive associations that we experience during adolescence. Here's another slide showing, and they say, loved it as a teen, love it forever, that songs that are most popular among those who were teens during particular years are of a particular age. So if you're a 41-year-old female, you probably had a preference for music from The Cure because it was released right when you were transitioning into adolescence. Another thing that is unique to adolescence is an increase in media consumption, and there's a lot of concern about whether or not social media is having a negative impact on brain development. Is it the case that because adolescents are so motivated by greater dopamine release, that they seek feedback and likes and all the rest of it that is associated with media? And one study that we did isn't related directly to Instagram or Facebook or anything like that, but we're simply interested in knowing how is it that increases in media consumption, and in particular, media consumption about world events that may be negative in nature, is it the case that the adolescent brain is somehow protective of the negative impacts of that media because they have greater sensitivity in the reward system? So as I mentioned, there's increased media exposure, not just in social media, but in ads and marketing and political rhetoric, current events. And so after the 2016 election, when obviously former President Trump was elected, my then graduate student, Sarah Tasjan, was interested in whether or not there was a role for mesolimbic circuitry in buffering any distress associated with the election, in particular populations of people. So she, within 4 months of the presidential election, she tested participants who felt affected by the election results in a negative way and compared them to a control group of participants who did not feel affected by the election result. These were the pre-screening questions. Do you think the result of the 2016 US presidential election will personally affect you? On a scale of 1 to 7, what was your emotional response? And what do you identify as your, various identities as listed here? Here are some demographic information about the control group and what she's called the affected group, for lack of a better term. These are people who were categorized in this group because they were affected by the election. They were worried about the election, how that would impact their daily lives based on their identity. We also collected qualitative information from these individuals. Here are a few quotes. I'm an African-American woman, so this election will affect laws not only for my health rights, but also create even more tension for minorities in everyday life. Since I am gay, I feel like hateful people will feel emboldened to discriminate against me. So you can see that there are a lot of different intersections between identity and development and the results of this election. We collected information about their psychological well-being, including depression scale and everyday discrimination scale, perceived support. And these participants also completed a commonly used reward task during fMRI, the monetary incentive delay task. If you're unfamiliar, here's a schematic showing what happens during the monetary incentive delay task. To summarize, individuals are presented with a queue associated with a particular dollar amount. And then at the end of the trial, they're told whether or not they earn a particular amount of money. Sarah conducted mediation and moderated mediation analyses to determine the relation between the distress individuals reported related to the election and also some psychological well-being measures such as depression and some anxiety. And she examined as moderators activation in the reward systems and connectivity between the reward system and the medial prefrontal cortex. What she found is that how distressed individuals were about the election significantly mediated the association between discrimination that they felt in their everyday lives and their depression symptoms. So in other words, someone whose experience with discrimination was associated with depression symptoms had a stronger relationship if they also felt a lot of election distress following the 2016 election. And this was only true in the participants in the affected group and not in the control group. We then turned our attention to examination of the brain activation in the reward system. And we did a quick quality control check and found that there was no difference in neural activation to reward between the two groups. So any of the data I show you are not related to inherent differences in how they processed reward, but found that activation in the striatum, or specifically the nucleus accumbens, significantly moderated the link between election distress and depression symptoms. In other words, here's a simple slopes representation of these findings, that individuals who had high activation in the nucleus accumbens showed this activation ameliorated the relationship between election distress and depression symptoms for those in the affected group. So in other words, if they had a greater activation to reward, if their brain was more stimulated by rewarding information, that helped dampen the relation between feelings of distress because of the election and their depression symptoms. The opposite was true with those individuals who didn't mount a very strong reward response in response to rewards in the nucleus accumbens. We also asked questions about family support and whether or not this variable was distinct in mediating the relationship between distress and depression symptoms. And to say that we first, again, did a quick check and found that there were no differences in family support experienced by those in the control group and those in the affected group. What we found is that family support significantly moderated the links between election distress and depression symptoms for those in the affected group. And here again is a simple representation showing that, unsurprisingly, if someone had high distress in the election, but high sense of family support, they had lower depression symptoms than those who felt high distress and low family support. And interestingly, this was a separate when we controlled for a brain activation to response to reward, this told us that there were separate mechanisms at play between family support and neural activation. I should say that we also asked questions about friend support, and the same relationship was not uncovered for friend support. And we think that that may be because with family, we may share more of the same identities than we do with friend groups. And so perhaps that shared kinship is what explains this association. So to summarize these data, engagement of the reward circuitry may serve as a buffer against exposure to negative media or political content. And that neurobiological and social resources offer two distinct avenues of protection against election-related distress or any kind of discriminatory distress. Sarah was curious to know whether or not the same relationship between brain and distress and depression symptoms endured over time. And so she did a longitudinal component of the study where she brought back the same individuals a year later. And what she found is that longitudinally, participants who were assessed 1 year later showed an increase in distress associated with the election or with the tenure of former President Trump, also showed increases in depression symptomatology, unsurprisingly. But again, those who showed a year later increased responsivity to reward outcome, that is, they showed greater activation in the accumbens in response to rewards, was associated with ameliorated distress. In other words, if they sustained greater response or reward sensitivity in the accumbens, that helped or was at least associated with a dampening of distress related to discrimination or the election. So, one of the things that we do in the lab is think about how the changes in the reward system and the prefrontal system may be related not simply to environmental events that occur during adolescence, including shifts in our behavior as associated with media or shifts in social relationships, but also in the more fundamental physiological changes that happen during adolescence. And one of those is related to sleep. In the past few years, I've become very interested in understanding how normative changes in the brain relate to also normative changes in sleep habits. And then at the end, I'll talk a little bit about how that relates to skill building that often occurs during adolescence, such as driving. Sleep is a basic need that suffers during adolescence. And whether or not you spend a lot of time with adolescents, you know that as kids become teenagers, they start to sleep less and less. However, that is at odds with the equal need for sleep in the adolescent brain. As new parents, we often think a lot about our infant's sleep and how much sleep they're getting, and we want to maximize the sleep environment for them. But it's also equally true that adolescents need just as much sleep. Their attention is torn a little bit more during adolescence because they have different interests and different needs and academic pressures, etc. But the unrested adolescent brain has consequences for not just their brain development and their academic learning, but also for their emotion regulation and social connection. This happens for a variety of reasons. One is that there are significant changes in circadian rhythms related to puberty. So when puberty strikes, the suprachiasmatic nucleus, which you can see here is this little purple dot, this brain region is solely responsible for regulating our relationship with light. And during adolescence, or specifically as related to pubertal hormones, there's a shift in our circadian rhythm, such that when the adolescent brain starts to feel sleepy is delayed relative to when adults feel sleepy. And so by nature, they want to go to sleep later. This is also related to melatonin changes. One of the roles of the suprachiasmatic nucleus is to direct the release of melatonin, which is the hormone that makes us feel sleepy. In adults, this starts to happen as the sun sets. In adolescents, this doesn't happen for 2 or 3 hours later. So again, there's a natural inclination and proclivity to push bedtime to a later time. This intersects with newfound independence in bedtimes. A lot of parents of adolescents share that there are some challenges that happen during adolescence, and so they start to give independence in small doses. One of the first ways that adults or parents give their adolescents independence is to let them set their own bedtime. On the one hand, this is great because the adolescent may feel a greater sense of respect, but on the other hand, this does limit the amount of sleep that adolescents are receiving. Obviously, technology used before bed is going to wake up our brain. So if you use technology right before bed, the brain is tricked into thinking that it's daylight outside, and so it's going to inhibit the amount of melatonin that is released. This matters because I don't need to tell this audience that sleep is associated with general health and well-being, with psychological outcomes and well-being. And so if adolescents are not getting enough sleep, this is going to interfere with their cognitive development, their emotional development, and perhaps with some psychological stability. Sleep has important implications for emotional reactivity and regulation. And as I'll get to later, it does have links with reckless driving, which is one of the skills that often starts to get built up during adolescence. By the time people are adolescents, they've mastered the basic skills, like I mentioned before, like walking and talking and basic motor skills. But driving is a newfound skill that has a lot of complexities and is related to how successful we are at it is related to the amount of sleep that we get. Sleep also has implications for policy. So I've done much less of this work, but I have a great collaborator in Texas who's examining how sleep is associated with juvenile detention, for example. There's also a lot of conversation about sleep and school start times, and recognizing that the decreases in sleep in adolescence may relate negatively to the early school start times that are getting earlier and earlier in some districts. The reason I even started studying sleep is because there's a strong relationship between the brain regions most impacted by poor sleep and those undergoing brain development during adolescence. This is a review in Nature Reviews Neuroscience by Matt Walker and his team, showing that in adults, showing that the sleep-deprived human brain is most impacted in the regions I've already talked about: the mesolimbic system, the striatum, the insula, regions of the prefrontal cortex. So it's interesting because these are the regions that are having ongoing brain development during adolescence and also most impacted by sleep. Matt Walker's work shows that adults who are sleep deprived experimentally, showed greater reactivity in the striatum. That is, in response to the same stimuli, they show greater reward sensitivity. In response to emotional stimuli, they show greater amygdala sensitivity. And so applying this to adolescents and adolescent research, we can see the links and the importance of studying how ongoing brain development interacts with sleep and sleep loss. The data I'm going to show you next come from research done by a recently graduated student in my lab, Amanda Baker, who used data from over 100 participants between the ages of 14 to 18, who provided information about the stressors in their life. They wore a sleep watch or an actigraph to monitor their sleep more objectively than does self-reported measures of sleep. We did also ask them some daily diary questions, very simply asking, how rested do you feel after your sleep? And also they participated in some scanning data. We found that the distribution of average sleep duration and variability over the 2-week period was nicely distributed. Participants in our sample had an average of 7 hours of sleep, and that's very consistent with data from the National Sleep Foundation for people of this age group. We also found that there was average variability of about an hour. So that means this is individual differences variability. So this is a variability that one individual experienced over the course of 2 weeks. So, let's say on a Monday, they got 7 hours of sleep. On a Tuesday, they got 8 hours. On a Wednesday, they got 6 hours. So that was the average amount of time that their own variability shifted throughout the 2 weeks. The reason that matters is because we know that the brain is very sensitive to what's called social jet lag. Social jet lag refers to the oscillation and kind of the whiplash that our brains experience when we are inconsistent in the amount of sleep that we get. And surprisingly, individuals who had more variability throughout the 2 weeks experienced less restfulness during that time, as reported by how much do you want to go back to bed and how rested do you feel for today. And so that tells us that obviously it's not just important to think about how long adolescents sleep or how long they're in bed, but how much variability they introduce to their sleep habits and sleep hygiene. We also collected data on their stress levels, and we found that, unsurprisingly, those with greater stress reported shorter sleep duration. That's not surprising. That's consistent with what we find in adults. But what was more of interest to us is that the greater self-reported demands or stress was associated with the greater sleep variability. And we did some path model analysis to examine this relationship and found that one additional demand, whether that was an extracurricular activity or greater responsibility in the home or academic pressures, one additional demand was associated with a 10-minute reduction in sleep and duration and 5-minute increase in sleep variability. And that's just one demand. Adolescents have many demands. So you can see how over time, these demands accumulate into leading to less sleep and greater sleep variability, all of which are negatively impacting the sleep health and implications from it. We found greater frontal limbic connectivity with increased sleep duration. So stated another way, individuals had greater sleep duration, showed greater connectivity or better communication between key brain regions in the prefrontal cortex and emotional regulation systems. And this is just another graph showing the same data, now focusing in on the left inferior frontal gyrus, which is crucial for emotion regulation, goal setting, etc. We also found that greater sleep variability was associated with enhanced communication among limbic networks. So those individuals who had a greater oscillation among variability, among their sleep hours, showed enhancement or greater reactivity among emotional systems and reward and risk systems. So just to summarize this, these data suggest that sleep health impacts the ongoing connectivity among brain networks that are central to social information processing, cognition, reward sensitivity. And also a reminder that sleeping longer is certainly beneficial for many adolescents, but there are also benefits to having consistent sleep patterns. And that although sleeping longer is beneficial, benefits may be reduced if there's the introduction of a lot of sleep variability. So the last thing I'll talk a little bit about is how this relates to a skill that, that is introduced during adolescence, and that is driving. And in particular, how sleep relates to reckless driving. Unsurprisingly, car accidents are still the leading cause of death for U.S. adolescents. And this is explained by both a lack of driving experience, coupled with maybe some risky decisions that may render adolescents more likely to be in accidents. We know that sleep impacts driving in individuals of all ages, and efforts to delay the school start time to be more representative of when the adolescent circadian rhythm is most responsive and most awake. A 1 hour delay in school start time reduced the risk of car crashes by improving the sleep. And the AAA Foundation estimates that 7% of all crashes and 16.5% of fatal crashes involve risky driving, particularly among new drivers or those between the ages of 16 and 24. Based on these data, my graduate student Amanda was interested in determining the relation between sleep and driving in an fMRI context. And so she collected data from adolescents between the ages of 14 and 18, again, on their sleep quality, their impulsivity, and some real-world driving behavior. In the MRI, she asked them to perform a task that may be familiar to many of you. It's the risky driving task, whereby they participants perform a computer task that simulates a racetrack, and whenever they see a green light, they are to go. When they see a red light, they are to stop the car, the simulated car, and when they see a yellow light, they make a choice about either stopping at the red light or going. And this is meant to mimic the real life kind of in the moment decisions that people make when they're driving. When I see a yellow light, should I go or should I stop? If I go, that's a risky choice. If I stop, that's a cautious choice. And by the way, in this study, as in all studies that use this task, the metric of riskiness is when they run the yellow light. She found that there was a relationship between the number of times they took the risk in the yellow light and their self-reported real-world risky driving. She found that, just some basic histograms here, sleep quality was normally distributed among the group, and it was not related to risk-taking on the task or sensation-seeking or impulsivity, and there were no sex differences, which is contrary to real life when there are sex differences and boys are more likely to engage in risky driving than girls. Task risk-taking was also not significantly related to sensation-seeking or age. What she did find is that the personality trait of sensation-seeking moderated the relation between poor sleep and risky driving, whereby individuals who are more likely to report greater sensation-seeking and who had worse sleep in general also had greater risk-taking on the task. Unsurprising. But it does lend some credibility to the utility of this task in measuring risk-taking that relates to real-world behavior. We turned our attention to the neural activation and again focused in on how is the brain representing this choice to make a risky decision when running the yellow light or not. And she found distributed activation in regions that are unsurprising: the amygdala, the mesolimbic system, the DLPFC, et cetera. And what she found is that the ventral striatum activation moderated the association between poor sleep and risky driving. Now, what you'll see on the left are the seeds we used in the ventral striatum analysis. The middle graph shows the representation of how better sleep was associated with decreased risky driving in adolescents in those with high activation in the ventral striatum during risk-taking. And the right-hand slide shows the simple slopes, illustrating in particular in the red box, that individuals with greater activation in the ventral striatum, represented by the open circles, was associated with that was moderated the relationship between better sleep and risk-taking behavior. So that those who had decreased activation in the ventral striatum during this risk-taking task didn't really matter what their sleep quality was like in relation to their risk-taking behavior. So to summarize this, the adolescent brain needs good quality, not just longer sleep. These sleep-brain interactions may serve as a buffer against health-compromising risk-taking behaviors. And I think it's important to think about these relationships with sleep and what's naturally occurring in the adolescent environment, such as driving, but also important to remember how sleep may impact individuals who are in atypical sleep environments. And one example of this, as I mentioned previously, is the opportunity to examine how sleep health may relate to individuals or adolescents who are in uncertain sleep environments, individuals who may move around through the foster system, individuals who are in juvenile detention, which represents certainly a suboptimal sleep environment. What you're looking at here on the right is an image from Richard Ross, who takes these really detailed photographs of young people in juvenile detention. And when I look at these pictures, I immediately focus in on the bright light overhead that's kept on all night, which we know light interferes with sleep, the very thin mattress, the lack of a pillow, and think about how the lack of opportunity for rest may impact the very regions that are necessary for emotion regulation, particularly in these very high stress, emotionally intense environments like a juvenile detention center. Incidentally, I didn't talk today about some data we've done where we asked individuals, adolescents, to tell us about their sleep environment. And to make a very long story short, we found that one of the key predictors of healthy or on-track development of connectivity between prefrontal and limbic systems is the presence of a good pillow. That individuals who told us that they found their pillows restful, their bedding to be particularly comfortable, were those who showed more advanced maturation of connectivity between these brain systems. So with that, I'll just summarize to say that the adolescent reward system is complex and interesting. It does a lot more than just represent reward and risk-taking behavior, but it also supports the key developmental needs of adolescents that include learning, motivation, emotion processing, sleep, and interacts with sleep and the skill building that is so necessary for adolescents as they transition into adulthood. And with that, I'll just thank everyone in my lab and who works with me on these projects, including the funding sources and collaborators, but highlight those who did the work represented here. And I'm happy to take questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Galván, for such a wonderful talk. We'll open it up for questions. I noticed that Dr. Glowinski had a question in the chat. Dr. Glowinski, could you unmute yourself and ask your question?
Sorry, I was trying to find the unmute button. Thank you so much. So my question has to do with this idea of reward sensitivity, which picks up in adolescence. And I'm thinking about patients who have ADHD and obviously have often, I mean, in general, a rewards orientation before adolescence and also long after. And I know that it's kind of a simplification, obviously, it's a simplified question, but I'm interested in a sense in the very heterogeneous outcomes that we know occur with ADHD we're both, at the world level, it's a very under-addressed phenotype, which is associated with a lot of poor outcomes, but also, at the level of success, innovation, and basically people who often are very interesting, they're also an overrepresentation of people with ADHD, and wondering about sort of the potential mediation in a sense of that sensitivity to reward, especially if harnessed in a certain way in terms of these good outcomes. So anyway, just your thoughts. I don't expect you to just give me a definite answer, but I thought it's an interesting question to me. So thank you.
It's an interesting question to me. Thank you for asking it. One of the what I love about your question is inherent, the notion that there are positive attributes to any phenotype, right? We can really think about how the inherent phenotypes of, for example, ADHD may be positive. As a postdoc, actually, I was going to say I did some work. I tried to do some work in adolescents with ADHD, but as you can imagine, it was really challenging to get them through the MRI scanner. It took, it's over an hour of a scan. So we have some data, but not anything that I would hang my hat on. But to say that that ADHD is fascinating because obviously there are different phenotypes and different ways in which ADHD presents itself, particularly between boys and girls and males and females. But one thing we do know is that surprisingly, we don't see greater, for example, risk-taking behavior in the scanner among adolescents who present with ADHD. And also that there are some fascinating data about how individuals may, as they show changes in brain maturation, the phenotypes associated with their ADHD may change and show decreases in reward sensitivity, actually, rather than what I would have predicted as increases in reward sensitivity. But other than that, I don't have a great definitive answer for you.
So I know other people may have questions, but so that's very interesting. The population where you don't see a difference in risk taking, is that a clinical population? Or like because I think the trick is also sort of the reality that in our clinical context, we see very few kids who have essentially just one dimension that is impacted. Right. And so, for example, the usual comorbidity of anxiety and ADHD that we tend to see, at least in some of our clinical systems, maybe not super related to risk taking, whereas I think if you go to the detention center that you were mentioning, you may have more kids who have a combination of ADHD and certain behaviors that gets them labeled as conduct disorder. And in that group, by definition, you're going to have some risk taking behavior, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I would be, I think I mentioned this colleague I have in Texas who's doing the work in the juvenile detention centers that would love to get these kids in a scanner, but obviously there are some logistical complexities with that, but thank you.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Any more questions? Please feel free to unmute yourself and ask your question. And if you're shy, feel free to also write in the chat. I can read that out.
Well, I'm also happy, Dr. Lee, I know I shared my slides. If anyone has any questions after, please feel free to email me. I think you have my contact information, and I would greatly welcome the feedback or the questions.
Great. Well, I have, just in the few minutes that we have, I have one question.
Mm-hmm.
With all this science about the adolescent brain and sleep, mm-hmm. how would you, use that and translate that to parents and to talk to them mm-hmm. about how they can best improve their adolescents' sleep?
Yes. Yeah, I think about this as a parent myself. My son is 12, so he's becoming a teenager very soon. And one of the things that, as I mentioned towards the end, is ensuring that your adolescent has a proper sleep environment, if it can be had. So is their pillow comfortable? Is their mattress comfortable? And as parents of young kids, as I mentioned, we think a lot about their sleep environment, but as they become teenagers, we're not asking these same questions about basic questions about their comfort level. So that's one thing. How much light are they getting? Is there a lot of noise in their room? And in the study that I mentioned, we also measured how much sleep technology they were using before bed. And we thought that would explain those kids who had good sleep versus not good sleep. It didn't, in part because there was no variation. All the kids were using technology before bed, so there was not a lot of variability there. But the other thing I would say is that sleep consistency is really important. We all think that we can make up sleep on the weekend, and that's just not true. The social jet lag phenomenon is real, and we cannot simply not sleep all week and then try to make up for it on the weekend. And the same is true for teenagers. And so having a sleep consistent schedule is really the most healthy way to get good sleep. But you know, in general, I think just as a culture, we don't value sleep the way other cultures do. And that's something that would obviously be a very huge shift in how we think about rest in this country, but it would be very helpful for adolescents who need the sleep for brain development.
Thank you. Anybody else? Well, I just wanted to say, thank you, Dr. Galván, for such a wonderful talk. It was so informative, and we learned so much from you. And I want to thank everybody for coming to our Grand Rounds. This is, again, the last Grand Rounds of 2022. So thank you for such a great year. And on behalf of Dr. Stewart, we are excited for our lineup in 2023. So please come back in January, and we hope to see you here. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Happy holidays.